But here in the US, we don't just settle on whitewashing our own guys. We'll whitewash your guys too, for free, because it makes us look good. Take Mandela. In textbooks, Nelson Mandela's identity is channeled through a few heroic archetypes. As a prisoner, whose release the world campaigned for, as a savior whose long-awaited release from prison would solve the country's problems, as a peacemaker who brings the country back from the brink of disaster, as a reconciler who forgives those who wronged him, and finally as a healer who brings restoration to those who suffered under apartheid. Like MLK, these kinds of narratives of Mandela as a peaceful, heroic, triumphant against all odds leader and embodiment of the whole movement against apartheid are used to present a false narrative of the anti-apartheid movement and mythologize Mandela beyond recognition. Mandela, while important, did not end apartheid through sheer force of will nor on his own. And it wasn't the simple fact that he spent nearly 3 decades imprisoned that upended the rule of the Nationalist Party. For one, Mandela and the ANC, the revolutionary group turned political party that has governed South Africa since 1994, spent years engaged in violent revolution with the intention of overthrowing the South African government. In self-defense, after decades of brutal oppression, imprisonment, murder, and abject rule by an explicitly white supremacist state, the peaceful protest that had been met with state violence no longer sufficed for the ANC and other militant South African groups, prompting Mandela himself to advocate transforming their strategy to one of violent revolt centered around sabotage, guerrilla warfare, terror, and open revolution, forming the armed wing of the ANC. Mandela wasn't the peace at all costs guy textbooks usually paint him as. He was an enemy of the state. Yeah, but then he left prison and he was fixed and he loved peace. Wrong again. The return to a non-violent approach in the later years of the anti-apartheid struggle, while widely attributed to Mandela, actually came from other influences in the movement, notably Joe Slovo, the leader of the South African Communist Party. Because Mandela was the face of the ANC at that time, he was the guy who announced it. But he was not the guy who initiated it. This is not to look down on Mandela and tarnish his image, by the way. This is to show that ending apartheid wasn't as easy as just sitting in jail for a while. And while we're talking about tarnishing his image, while all this was happening, Mandela was, like MLK, one of those most hated men of the moment. Far from being championed by the international community, Mandela and the ANC's revolt earned them the label of terrorists. He was so a terrorist, actually, that it took until 2008 for the US to stop labeling him and the ANC as such. If that sounds bad, it gets worse. The US did much more than simply labeling anti-apartheid actors terrorists. Despite growing calls from the American public to end relations with the apartheid nationalist government, successive presidential administrations refused to meaningfully hear the calls of anti-apartheid militants and actively supported the continuation of apartheid through purposefully weak policies that would ensure US business and geopolitical interests in the region would be uninterrupted. Most of this support for the ruling apartheid party came from the fact that the ANC and the other groups they worked with were a mix of socialists and communists with broad support from socialist experiments elsewhere in the world, entangling the US response to apartheid South Africa with its overall Cold War policies. Mandela, who openly advocated for nationalizing mines, banks, and monopoly industries after his release from prison, was far too close to the socialist line to receive direct US support. To give you an idea of how critical the US support for the nationalists was, it was only once the Cold War had ended that the US began meaningfully reversing its strategy and apartheid was lifted, though only after decades of the US actively enabling apartheid to endure, and only bolstered as the ANC shifted towards a neoliberal program. The problem is that these changes in how we tell this story, and the fact that we place a whitewashed Mandela at the center of it, purposefully attempts to pacify the US's history and its persistent involvement with the suppression of movements for racial and economic justice. The focus on the 27 years Mandela spent in prison gives the impression that the anti-apartheid struggle was on pause, non-violent, and mostly happening on American college campuses. It diverts attention away from the long support of successive administrations for the nationalist government and their politics of racial segregation and white supremacist violence, and the efforts undertaken by a whole network of South African revolutionaries. The point is that by whitewashing MLK and Mandela, the whitewashing bleeds over and whitewashes the United States too, when the truth is that the US has been, and to this day still remains, a barrier to policies carried by people we applaud as heroes, but fail to actually listen to. Here's a few sentences on one of the movements that got the other side of the whitewashing coin: demonization. Demonization plays just as important a role as whitewashing, and it only really works when you've also created a whitewashed foil to play against it. So people like Malcolm X and the Panthers get the other raw end of the deal. Here are some of the facts that get left out. The Black Panthers, targeted by the FBI's COINTELPRO and still remembered as domestic terrorists by much of the American public, led community projects to support and defend the black community. Free breakfast programs were instituted by the party to reduce food insecurity, particularly for young kids. Health clinics were opened to fight medical discrimination, and party members did patrols to monitor police officers when they stopped black people in order to prevent instances of police brutality. The Black Panthers explicitly and with intentionality continued the mission of MLK and the Poor People's Campaign, only to be remembered as the bad guys with guns who went too far. That is why the whitewashed image of MLK is so valuable to the ruling class. They can pay lip service to a black hero while positioning him against his very own ideas. As one final parting thought, consider this. If you think that the Black Lives Matter movement is violent or unreasonable or moving too fast, you would 100% be in that 2/3 of Americans who said the same exact things about MLK. Guaranteed. So please, if you're going to honor Dr. King, do it right. Honor his actual legacy, one of devotion to the poor, the downtrodden, those that this country and the world have cast aside in favor of the almighty dollar. Martin Luther King Jr. was anti-war, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist. If your own worldview doesn't reflect those ideals, and you use Dr. King as a rhetorical weapon, you're being dishonest. But it's never too late to change your perspective.